Whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth. Our country doesn't have much raw earth.
Really strategic reserves of minerals that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of.
This is a president who doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk too.
We'll also take historic action to dramatically expand production of critical minerals.
Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive.
Canada is in the process of replacing its aging fleet of submarines, a decision that could have significant consequences for both national security and international relations. The United States, under President Donald Trump, has aggressively pursued a $20 billion contract, urging Canada to award these submarine contracts to American shipyards. However, in a move that shocked many, Canada has decided to reject this demand and keep the contracts within its own borders. This decision to keep the contracts for domestic shipbuilders, specifically in Halifax and Vancouver, is a major shift in the defense relationship between the two countries. For years, Canada has relied on American suppliers for military and defense technology, but now, in a strategic move, Canada has chosen to assert its independence and control over its own defense needs. This could change the balance of power in defense contracting, and the implications are already being felt in both countries. The Canadian government's refusal to send these critical defense contracts to American shipyards isn't just about economics. It's a reflection of broader concerns about sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and national security. By keeping the contracts in Canadian yards, Canada ensures that its defense infrastructure remains under its own control, rather than depending on foreign suppliers. This move is also a signal to the U.S. that Canada is not afraid to chart its own course when it comes to military and defense matters. For the United States, the consequences of Canada's decision are immediate and severe. From shipyards in Virginia to steel mills in Pittsburgh, the ripple effect of this rejection is already being felt. American workers who were counting on these contracts to provide jobs are now left in a state of uncertainty. In some of the country's most important industrial regions, labor leaders are warning that layoffs could be imminent. What was expected to be a massive boost for the American defense industry is now nothing more than a broken promise. The timing of Canada's decision couldn't be worse. Just months ago, President Trump promised that these submarine contracts would bring jobs back to American workers, revitalizing the U.S. defense industry. His administration had pushed hard to ensure that American shipyards using U.S. steel, U.S. labor, and U.S. technology would be the ones to build these submarines. But now those promises are falling apart. The workers who had been preparing for these contracts, from welders in Norfolk to machinists in Pittsburgh, are now left without any clear path forward. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a political one as well. For years, the U.S. and Canada have enjoyed a close defense relationship. The U.S. has long been a key supplier of military technology to Canada, and both nations have worked together to maintain stability in North America. But now, with Canada choosing to build these submarines domestically, that relationship is being tested, and the implications of this decision could extend far beyond the defense industry. Behind the headlines lies a deeper story, a growing sense of frustration in Canada over the United States' trade policies. Earlier this year, the U.S. imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel, materials that are critical to the production of submarines. Canada, in turn, retaliated with its own set of tariffs and trade restrictions. The tension was building, and Canada's refusal to give in to Trump's demand may be the culmination of months of growing frustration over the U.S.'s aggressive trade policies. From Canada's perspective, the decision to reject the submarine contracts is about more than just defense. It's about asserting control over its own future and ensuring that the country isn't beholden to a foreign power when it comes to critical national security matters. This isn't just about submarines. It's about Canada's ability to make decisions on its own terms, without interference from the United States. And this decision could mark the beginning of a broader shift in the global defense landscape, as other nations watch closely to see how the U.S. responds. For the American defense industry, the immediate fallout is already clear. With billions of dollars in potential contracts now off the table, the economic consequences are severe. From Ohio's steel foundries to Wisconsin's electronics manufacturers, suppliers across the country had already ramped up production in anticipation of the Canadian orders. Now, with those orders canceled, American workers and businesses are left scrambling for new opportunities. But the economic pain goes beyond the immediate loss of these contracts. The larger question is what this means for the future of the U.S. defense industry. The U.S. has long been the largest player in global defense contracting, with American shipyards and defense contractors supplying military technology to countries around the world. But if countries like Canada are now choosing to go their own way, what does that mean for the future of American dominance in this sector? The world is changing, and this decision by Canada is just the beginning of a larger shift in how defense contracts are awarded. The immediate reaction to Canada's decision has been nothing short of a crisis in the U.S. defense sector. With the loss of billions of dollars in contracts, key players in the industry are scrambling to make up for the shortfall. The impact is being felt across the U.S., particularly in defense-heavy regions like Virginia, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Workers who were expecting to see a surge in demand for their skills are now left with uncertainty, and many are bracing for layoffs. In Groton, Connecticut, home to one of the most important submarine shipyards in the U.S., labor unions are already warning that the loss of the Canadian contract could lead to widespread layoffs. The shipyard, which had been preparing to build the submarines for Canada, is now facing a significant loss of business. The workers there, who had been promised long-term job security, are now watching as their livelihoods hang in the balance. The same situation is playing out in Newport News, Virginia, where Huntington Ingalls Industries had been gearing up to accommodate the Canadian orders. But now, with those orders gone, the workers are left wondering what will happen next. The fallout doesn't stop at shipyards. Steel mills in Pittsburgh, which had ramped up production of the materials needed for the submarines, are now staring at empty order books. These mills had been preparing for years to supply the raw materials for the Canadian submarine project, only to see those orders evaporate overnight. In Ohio, manufacturers of sonar and communication systems for the submarines are facing similar challenges, with purchase orders being frozen and production lines coming to a halt. It's not just the workers who are feeling the pain. Entire communities are being affected. In places like Youngstown, Ohio, where specialized steel foundries are a key part of the local economy, the cancellation of these contracts is a massive blow. For many of these towns, the promise of defense contracts was seen as a lifeline, a way to bring jobs back to areas that had been suffering from the decline of traditional manufacturing. Now, that lifeline has been cut, and these communities are left to pick up the pieces. At the heart of this issue is a growing sense of betrayal. For months, President Trump had promised that these defense contracts would be the cornerstone of his strategy to revitalize U.S. manufacturing. He had vowed to bring jobs back to America, particularly in industries like defense that had been hurt by outsourcing and foreign competition. Trump repeatedly stated that these contracts would not only strengthen national security, but also provide long-term job security for American workers. But now, with Canada pulling the plug on the deal, those promises are being called into question. The political ramifications of this decision are also significant. In Washington, Trump's allies are livid. They accuse Canada of undermining American workers and national security. Some even suggest that Canada is putting its own interests ahead of the long-standing defense relationship between the two countries. There are growing calls for retaliation, with some pushing for new tariffs on Canadian goods or restrictions on defense cooperation between the two nations. The rhetoric is heated, and it's clear that this issue is far from being resolved. However, the situation is not as simple as it might first appear. While Trump and his supporters have been quick to blame Canada for the loss of these contracts, there's a deeper story at play. For years, the U.S. has been imposing tariffs on Canadian products, including steel and aluminum, which are essential materials for building submarines. Canada's decision to reject the U.S. contract may be, in part, a response to those tariffs, as well as a broader strategy to protect its own defense industry. It's also worth noting that Canada's decision is part of a larger trend. In recent years, there's been a growing push in many countries to reduce reliance on foreign defense suppliers and to build up their own military-industrial bases. Canada's move to keep these contracts domestic is in line with this broader shift, as more countries seek to become self-sufficient when it comes to national security and defense production. For Canada, this decision is about more than just economics. It's about asserting control over its own future and ensuring that the country is not dependent on a foreign power for critical national security needs. By keeping these contracts within its own borders, Canada is signaling that it is ready to take more responsibility for its defense and military capabilities. This move also highlights the growing divergence in how the U.S. and Canada approach issues of national security and defense cooperation. For the U.S., however, this decision represents a serious blow to its position as the dominant player in the global defense market. The U.S. has long enjoyed a privileged position, with many countries relying on American suppliers for defense technology and military equipment. But Canada's decision shows that the U.S. is no longer the only option for countries seeking to build or modernize their defense infrastructure. If other countries follow Canada's lead and choose to go with domestic suppliers instead of U.S. companies, it could spell the end of America's dominance in the global defense industry. In the short term, the loss of these contracts is a major setback for the U.S. defense industry. But in the long run, it could have far-reaching consequences. The U.S. may find itself in a world where its once dependable allies no longer look to American shipyards or manufacturers for their defense needs. This could lead to higher costs, reduced production, and a weaker global position for the U.S. defense sector. And as other nations look to diversify their defense suppliers, the U.S. will have to work harder to maintain its competitive edge. The ripple effects of Canada's decision to reject U.S. submarine contracts extend far beyond just the U.S. defense industry. This move signals a shift in global defense dynamics, one that could redefine how countries approach military procurement in the future. For decades, the U.S. has held the dominant position as the go-to supplier for advanced military technology. But Canada's bold move to build its own submarines and keep these vital contracts within its borders shows that the balance of power in defense contracting may be starting to change. Canada's decision also comes at a time when other nations are reassessing their own defense relationships with the U.S. Countries that have long relied on American military suppliers are now looking for ways to diversify their sources of defense technology. As geopolitical tensions rise, nations are increasingly wary of becoming too dependent on a single supplier for critical military equipment. Canada, by choosing to invest in its own defense infrastructure, is positioning itself as a potential alternative to U.S. suppliers for other countries seeking greater self-sufficiency in their military capabilities. For the U.S., this development is a wake-up call. The loss of these contracts highlights the vulnerability of its defense sector, particularly as other countries become more willing to pursue independent defense solutions. The U.S. has long had an advantage in global defense markets due to its scale, technology, and production capacity. However, if countries like Canada, which have historically been key defense partners, begin to shift their focus away from U.S. suppliers, the U.S. may find itself struggling to maintain its dominance in the global defense industry. The global implications of this shift are already being felt. As countries look to develop their own domestic defense industries, the competition for defense contracts will intensify. Nations that once relied on American military technology may increasingly turn to domestic suppliers or other nations that offer alternative solutions. This trend could lead to fragmented defense markets, with each country seeking to protect its own interests rather than cooperating under the umbrella of large defense alliances like NATO. Canada's decision to build its own submarines and pursue domestic defense production also has the potential to alter the power dynamics within NATO. The U.S. has historically shouldered the majority of the defense burden within the alliance, with many NATO countries relying on U.S. suppliers for military equipment and technology. However, as more nations like Canada take steps to reduce their reliance on the U.S., the very foundation of NATO's defense cooperation could be called into question. If key allies begin to assert more independence in their defense procurement, it could weaken the cohesion of the alliance and shift the balance of power within it. This shift is not limited to NATO members. Countries in Asia and the Middle East, who have traditionally turned to the U.S. for defense technology, may also begin to explore alternative options. With China and Russia ramping up their own defense production capabilities, the U.S. may face increasing competition in global defense markets, not just from traditional allies, but also from rising powers seeking to challenge American dominance. At the same time, the growing trend of self-sufficiency in defense production could have serious consequences for the U.S. military's ability to maintain its technological edge. The U.S. military has long relied on the strength of its defense industrial base to stay ahead of potential adversaries. If other nations are able to develop their own advanced military technologies, the U.S. could find itself facing more formidable competition in future conflicts. While Canada's decision to reject U.S. contracts is a setback for the American defense industry, it also offers an opportunity for the U.S. to reevaluate its position in the global defense market. Rather than focusing on maintaining its dominant position, the U.S. may need to embrace a more collaborative approach to defense procurement, working with allies to build more integrated defense systems that benefit all parties. This could involve greater technology sharing and joint ventures that allow for the development of new capabilities while still maintaining the strength of the U.S. military. However, this shift in strategy will require significant changes in how the U.S. approaches defense policy. The Trump administration's America First policies, which have focused on bringing defense contracts and manufacturing back to the U.S., may need to be rethought in light of these changing global dynamics. Instead of focusing solely on protecting U.S. suppliers, the U.S. may need to shift its focus to strengthening its relationships with allies and finding ways to ensure that defense technology remains accessible to all nations within the alliance. In the meantime, Canada's decision has set a precedent that other nations are likely to follow. As countries increasingly look to control their own defense industries, the U.S. may find itself in a world where it no longer holds a dominant position in defense contracting. This could lead to a more fragmented, competitive global defense market, where nations are less reliant on the U.S. and more focused on developing their own capabilities. For Canada, this move represents a significant step toward greater independence in defense matters. By investing in its own defense industry, Canada is signaling to the world that it is ready to take on a greater role in global security. This could lead to increased partnerships with other countries that are also seeking to reduce their dependence on the U.S. for military technology. While Canada's decision to keep these contracts at home may seem like a loss for the U.S., it could ultimately serve as a catalyst for change in the global defense industry. The U.S. will need to adapt to this new reality, finding ways to remain competitive in an increasingly multipolar defense market. If the U.S. fails to adapt, it risks losing its position as the world's leading defense supplier, while other nations like Canada may emerge as more powerful players on the global stage. As the consequences of Canada's decision continue to unfold, the U.S. is facing some tough questions about its future in the global defense market. The loss of this $20 billion contract is a setback, but it's also a sign of the shifting global landscape. The U.S. can no longer assume that its allies will automatically rely on American defense contractors for their military needs. Countries like Canada, which have historically been loyal partners in defense, are now making independent decisions that could change the nature of global defense cooperation. For the U.S., this is a moment of reckoning. The country's defense industry has long been a pillar of its economic and military power. But as Canada and other nations look to build their own defense industries and reduce their dependence on foreign suppliers, the U.S. could find itself facing more competition in its own backyard. This could have serious implications for national security as well as for the economy. If U.S. defense contractors lose market share to domestic producers in allied countries, it could undermine the scale and efficiency of the American defense sector. The implications of this shift are not limited to defense contractors alone. The U.S. military, which has long relied on the strength of its defense industry to maintain technological superiority, could also feel the effects. If other nations begin to build their own advanced military technologies, the U.S. could find itself in a position where it no longer has the technological edge it once enjoyed. This could reduce the country's ability to project power and maintain its strategic advantage in global conflicts. At the same time, the U.S. must consider the broader geopolitical implications of this shift. As Canada and other countries take steps towards self-sufficiency in defense, the dynamics of international alliances are changing. The U.S. has historically used its defense contracts as a tool of influence, providing military technology to its allies in exchange for support on the global stage. But as more nations look to diversify their sources of defense technology, this tool of influence may lose its power. This shift could also affect the U.S.'s standing within NATO. For decades, the U.S. has shouldered the majority of the defense burden within the alliance, with many NATO countries relying on American suppliers for military equipment and technology. But if countries like Canada begin to move away from American suppliers, it could weaken the cohesion of the alliance and shift the balance of power within NATO. The U.S. could find itself in a situation where its allies are more focused on their own defense needs than on maintaining the U.S.-led order within the alliance. For Canada, the decision to keep these contracts within its own borders is a significant step toward greater independence in defense matters. Canada is sending a clear message to the world. It is ready to take on a larger role in global security and is not afraid to make decisions that prioritize its own national interests. This could open the door for Canada to form new partnerships with other nations, particularly those in Europe and Asia, who may also be seeking to reduce their dependence on the U.S. for defense technology. This shift in defense procurement could also have broader economic implications for both the U.S. and Canada. The U.S. has long relied on defense spending to support high-paying manufacturing jobs, but with the loss of these contracts, those jobs could be at risk. Meanwhile, Canada's decision to invest in its own defense industry could create new job opportunities and help stimulate economic growth in regions that have traditionally been less dependent on defense spending. In the coming months, the U.S. will likely face growing pressure to find new ways to maintain its position in the global defense market. One option could be to ramp up domestic defense spending, with the government increasing funding for U.S. shipyards and contractors in an effort to offset the lost Canadian contracts. But this strategy would come at a significant cost, particularly in a time of rising national debt and budget deficits. Another option could be to seek new defense contracts from countries in Asia, the Middle East, or Latin America. However, this approach would be time-consuming and uncertain, as these countries may already be looking to diversify their defense suppliers. Ultimately, the U.S. will need to re-examine its defense policies and its relationships with key allies. The world is changing, and the old ways of doing business in the defense industry may no longer be viable. If the U.S. is to maintain its leadership role in global security, it will need to adapt to a more competitive and multipolar defense market. This could involve more collaboration with allies, greater sharing of defense technology, and a shift away from a reliance on unilateral control over global defense supply chains. The consequences of Canada's decision are clear, and the U.S. now finds itself at a crossroads. The loss of these submarine contracts is a wake-up call, but it's also an opportunity for the U.S. to rethink its defense strategy and its place in a rapidly changing world. As Canada and other nations move toward greater self-sufficiency, the U.S. must find new ways to remain competitive in the global defense market. The future of the U.S. defense industry and its role in global security depends on how the country responds to this challenge.